Hello, I'm Christine Goh and I'm speaking from Singapore. I work at the National Institute of Education, which is part of the Nanyang Technological University. I'm interested in listening, speaking and pronunciation, as well as metacognition and language learning. I'm also interested in teacher cognition and the effect it has on language teaching and teacher education. In this video, I'm going to talk briefly about a paper that I published recently in the ELTJ. The title for this paper is Perspectives on Spoken Grammar. In this paper, I compared the views of two groups of teachers concerning the pedagogic relevance of spoken grammar. I came across a particular view that's been articulated by Michael McCarthy and Ron Carter in support of spoken grammar, and I'd like to just quote it here. Language pedagogy that claims to support the teaching and learning of speaking skills does itself a disservice if it ignores what we know about the spoken language. Whatever else may be the result of imaginative methodologies for eliciting spoken language in a second language classroom, there can be little hope for a natural spoken output on the part of the language learners if the input is stubbornly rooted in models that owe their origin and shape to the written language. Now, this argument seems to make a lot of sense, and it's certainly something that all language teachers and language teacher educators should consider. But is a model of spoken grammar that's derived mainly from a corpus of British spoken English appropriate for all language learners in different parts of the world? Well, recently in 2005, Timmis published an article also in ELTJ where he reported favorable responses from teachers to the teaching of spoken grammar. In his article, he also reported the use of the ways in which teachers could be trained to teach spoken grammar. Now, as the teachers in this particular study were based in the UK, it seems natural and almost it's not a surprise then that these teachers found the teaching of spoken grammar to be important and to be relevant to their teaching context. The question remains, however, whether the teaching of spoken grammar is needed or is desirable in countries where the speakers may not be speaking to English, to speakers from the United Kingdom, where situations where the learners may use English with speakers from the region. And this was exactly the question that I posed to the students in my postgraduate classes. Okay, let me now go into the details of the article. In this article entitled Perspectives on Spoken Grammar, I reported the views of two groups of teachers who were doing postgraduate courses in the National Institute of Education. The teachers were from three different programs, but they were all doing similar courses which focused on the teaching and research of listening and speaking. For the purpose of comparison, I grouped the teachers according to the nationality. One group consisted of teachers from Singapore who were mainly teachers in primary and secondary schools, and there were 35 of these teachers. In the second group, there were 37 teachers, and they comprised teachers from the People's Republic of China. And these Chinese teachers were teaching EFL in colleges as well as the Chinese high schools. The teachers participated in an online discussion forum with their classmates, and this is part of the activity in the course that they took, and it followed on from a session in class where they were introduced to the concept of spoken grammar, and where they also learned to identify spoken grammar forms. They also read an article by Ron Carter entitled The Grammar of Talk, Spoken English, Grammar and the Classroom. In the online forum that they participated in, the teachers were asked to respond to two questions. The first question is linguistic information from British English data reviewed in the CanCode project useful for teaching learners about spoken language? And the second question is, can knowledge of spoken grammar forms improve learners' spoken language performance? I found the views that were expressed by the teachers in the online forums to be very interesting and insightful. And I thought that they were also potentially interesting to teachers in other places and other teaching contexts. So, with their permission, I analyzed their views more systematically and presented them in an article for a journal. I'm going to talk now about the results of the comparison. The first question in the forum invited teachers to express their opinion on the usefulness of British spoken grammar norms. Here we see a marked difference between the two groups of teachers. The Chinese EFL teachers were overwhelmingly positive about the use of native speaker norms, and in this case British English. 35 out of the 37 teachers felt that it was important, it was crucial, it was motivating for language learners to resort to a model that is provided by native speakers. What they did say, however, was that the model should not be confined to just British English, but should also include varieties of native speaker English from countries like America, Australia, and Canada. One of the teachers said this: it reveals an authentic picture of language use to students, a world full of incomplete sentences, phrases, vague language, and discourse markers. And the teacher felt that this was necessary for the learners. Singapore teachers, on the other hand, were somewhat divided in their views. Some felt that they were comfortable referring to British spoken English norms in their teaching because they believed that it is a useful reference that could provide a set of standard rules that learners could follow. A small percentage of the teachers, however, were totally against the idea of using an exonormative features or standard because they felt that Singapore already has its own variety of English. The second discussion question focused on knowledge about spoken grammar and language performance. Once again, the Chinese EFL teachers felt that knowledge of spoken grammar would be extremely useful to their learners. One of the reasons given was that it would help learners to become more confident when they had to speak English. And here's what one of the teachers said: my students do not have to think too much of the structure of the language, which in fact can prevent the communication process. For example, the knowledge of ellipses or flexible positioning in spoken grammar might to some extent encourage the students to overcome the psychological obstacle and speak out without thinking too much. Most of the Chinese, in fact all the Chinese teachers, EFL teachers, agreed that their learners often had the misconception that they should speak in complete sentences and that they should use perfect grammar as in the written language. Now, the Chinese EFL teachers also felt that their learners would benefit from knowing about spoken grammar because it would reduce their anxiety. One of the teachers said, for example, they may feel relaxed to know that there are a lot of phrasal utterances and ellipses in British daily conversations. The Chinese teachers also believed that learners would be able to speak more naturally if they knew about spoken grammar forms. While having been language learners themselves, they understood the need to avoid sounding too stilted or bookish, as some of them have said, And we can see that this view resonates very well with the view that was put forward by McCarthy and Carter, the view which I referred to earlier in this video. The teachers from Singapore, however, had rather different views. They were concerned that their students' knowledge of spoken grammar might in some way interfere with the grammar of the written language. And teachers who teach students who come from what we refer to as neighborhood schools are particularly concerned. Neighborhood schools are schools where most of the students come from homes that do not speak English, or where homes speak a variety of English that is considered to be non-standard, and it's commonly referred to as Singlish here. One of the teachers has this to say: "I'm against explicit teaching of such characteristics, as it would confuse students' knowledge of written grammar. As it is in Singapore neighborhood schools, we are struggling to help students eradicate traces of spoken grammar in their written essays. Example, contractions, abbreviations, flexible positioning of clauses, and even ellipses. Teaching explicit features of spoken grammar would probably do more harm than good, at least with respect to the written word." On the whole, teachers in Singapore seem to prefer their students to speak using the neat grammar of writing without the so-called messiness of spontaneous speech. They were particularly concerned that their students would not be able to speak well in formal situations. As for informal situations, the teachers seem to feel that the students already have their own spoken grammar in the form of Singlish. Well, when we look at the results of the comparison as a whole, we can see that there is a broad consensus of opinion in one area, and this is in the importance of using spoken grammar for raising language learners' awareness about the difference between the spoken and the written language. But the two groups of teachers generally had different attitudes to native speaker norms. This reflected the different social-linguistic landscapes that the teachers worked in. The Chinese teachers, who were once language learners themselves, felt that native speaker norms were necessary, and that they were also empowering and motivating for any language learner. Teachers from Singapore, however, were more cautious, and they felt that even though spoken English based on British norms have a role to play, it should not take a prominent role in the teaching of English in the country. There were nevertheless similar concerns amongst the two groups of teachers. First of all, some teachers found the concept of spoken grammar to be rather difficult to grasp. They felt that it was different from their understanding of traditional grammar. They were particularly ambivalent in respect of the apparently ungrammatical nature of spoken grammar. Some grammar forms, such as heads, tails, and ellipses, for example, were seen to be deviations from established notions of correct grammar, grammar that followed the SVO or the SVC structure. Some teachers were also constrained by a narrow interpretation of the term grammar. For example, they were confused by the reference to lexical items such as hopefully, perhaps, as part of spoken grammar, because they felt that these were not similar to the grammar terms or grammar words that they were familiar with. There were also concerns about the use of "and" in multiple coordinations of clauses. And the use of vague language was also something that some teachers talked about. Some teachers felt that they should not encourage their students to use vague language such as sort of, kind of, because they felt that this was sloppy. More importantly, they felt that this kind of language should not be used in formal situations. And so they rather have the students try to speak a variety that is more formal, that follows the grammar of the written language, rather than for them to learn some of these features. Well, some teachers also had practical concerns with respect to assessment. It appears that in both contexts, oral examiners might not be ready to accept some of the features of spoken English in spontaneous British speech. So teachers were particularly concerned, for example, that students would be penalized if they use heads or tails in the utterances that they produce. Some teachers were also concerned that examiners themselves might not be aware of spoken grammar and the relevance of spoken grammar, and may not or may actually penalize learners who use these forms. Well, in this video, I've tried to highlight some some findings in my comparison between the two groups of teachers. I have not gone into the reasons when discussing the differences, but I hope that this short introduction to the article would have been interesting enough for some of you to want to read the article for yourself. I guess that's all I have to say, so thank you very much for listening.